Hello, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we have a philosophical talks with Stephen Friedman. It's a regular program, but today's session is quite unusual. On the 30th of November, the world celebrates World Philosophical Day. And on this occasion, American Space Almaty provided you with a unique chance to get access to the play show of Stephen Friedman. And today you will have very good chance to ask whatever questions, philosophical questions you have to the author himself. But first of all, let me introduce a special guest, U.S. Consul General, Mr. Eric Meyer.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Sharon. Today is a special day because we're celebrating World Philosophy Day this week. And I'm just going to start off. I wanted to read something that the United Nations has actually prepared in commemoration of World Philosophy Day. The United Nations says that World Philosophy Day invites the world to reflect on the meaning of the current pandemic, underlying the need more than ever to resort to philosophical reflection in order to face the multiple crises we are going through. Stephen has been giving talks now for a while on a wide range of topics: education, the elections, and the pandemic. He's talked about health issues, and it's just very special that this week we're celebrating World Philosophy Day. And I want to thank Stephen for his time and for all of the talks that he's delivered so far to audiences in Kazakhstan and beyond. And as we think about World Philosophy Day, it is important to raise, I think, public awareness of the importance of philosophy and its critical use in the choices arising from many societies as it relates to the health crisis, globalization, a number of issues. And I've known Stephen for a long time. My first introduction to philosophy was through Stephen. I was studying Danish, and I learned about the Danish philosopher Søren Kierkegaard through Steve. And since then, I have read a lot of his writings, and I consult with Steve a lot on many issues related to philosophy, and we're very lucky to have him. For those of you who are not aware, the New York Times did acclaim him as a genius philosopher. And so it gives me a great pleasure to not only welcome Stephen again, but again, I would like to thank him for speaking with us today and for the weekly talks that he delivers. So Stephen, happy World Philosophy Day. Thank you for joining us. And the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. I want to first begin by thanking everybody associated with the consulate, the American consulate in Almaty. Sharon, our moderator, who weekly does an extraordinary job moderating these talks. Tracy Abel, who has been involved in this project from its inception. In fact, it was Tracy who had done some arrangements for me to return to Kazakhstan about 6 months ago or so, but the pandemic interrupted those plans. And so Tracy was searching for some alternatives that could be done virtually, remotely. And her proposal was to do something for World Philosophy Day. And we sort of quickly came up with the idea of possibly showing Phalaris's Bull, the film of a play that I did in New York about 5 years ago, that is both an autobiographical treatment, but primarily of the factors that were responsible for the development of my philosophical results, but in the broad context of philosophy's history and powers and potential in many different directions. Well, we also considered the possibility of my giving a talk associated with the showing of the film of the play. That's what happened yesterday, today. I think the film was made available for general viewing yesterday. Maybe it's still available. And I'm going to be talking in general about philosophy broadly. I have in some of the previous talks addressed health issues, issues of stress, mental health, the pandemic. So I'm going to be making this a little bit broader, as a presentation in relation to the breadth and the scope of philosophy and of the play. And just to also explain the genesis of the weekly talks, since World Philosophy Day was some months away when we were making those plans, Tracy suggested the possibility of my doing weekly talks through the American spaces and addressing different issues from a philosophical perspective on a weekly basis. And that is what led both to the talks and ultimately to this particular occasion. Now, where I am in Los Angeles, it's still World Philosophy Day. It's November 19th still. There's an interesting concordance, a convergence. I use this word convergence a lot when I discuss not so much philosophy in its pure form, but in its applications. Well, one of the happy convergences of November 19th being World Philosophy Day this year is it also happens to be the anniversary of the Gettysburg Address, which is one of the finest statements of philosophy in relation to principles of government, of self-government that we have. So that was delivered on this date in 1863, so 157 years ago. And it's a happy coincidence because it's Abraham Lincoln is a president and a writer and a speaker that I have enormous regard for. I've talked about education in some of our previous talks. He was largely self-educated, educated himself on the works of Shakespeare. So I use as an example of how one doesn't need breadth when achieving mastery of certain fundamental educational skills like writing. It was enough for Abraham Lincoln to focus upon Shakespeare, upon the King James Bible that was produced around the same time as Shakespeare. So, and Abraham Lincoln also gives us a good representation of how precise language and concise representation is central, not just to clarity of thought and clarity of result, which is central to the philosophical enterprise, but to achieving results and formulations that last. It's famous that on the day that Abraham Lincoln delivered his address, there was another speaker that spoke for over 2 hours. We don't remember the contents of that address, but we do remember the 271 words of the Gettysburg Address. And philosophy aims, and certainly my philosophical writing aims, for that same concise representation, that distillation of thought. Okay, when I first began making my philosophical results public, I, about 20 years ago, prepared a website. And in introducing philosophy in that website, I raised the question, it was the first sentence that I wrote, what is philosophy and why should anyone care? And I answered the 4 Ds: disease, despair, death, dating. Now, that range of concerns is simply meant to illustrate the fact that philosophy's interests are the broadest of all intellectual pursuits. They're the broadest and the deepest. Philosophy considers everything to be within its province, considers itself, because it operates at such a high level of generality, that it's looking down on every discipline, seeing it in relation to other disciplines, and is in the singular position of being able to advance and critique, not the discipline's details, but a discipline's methodologies, the key to what makes it possible to do a particular intellectual pursuit, such as science. Philosophy was the ultimate progenitor of science. It created the scientific method. People like Francis Bacon, philosophers, the empiricist philosophers of the 17th century, they were instrumental in formulating, elaborating, developing the method of science. So science itself is an offshoot of philosophers and philosophy. Philosophy has that type of power. Because it's able to create these methodologies, it's also able to critique them, refine them, improve them, from a unique perspective, a perspective outside and looking in on what the enterprise is trying to achieve. Philosophy has had a pervasive influence in all aspects of contemporary life, human history, but also up to the present. I've mentioned Abraham Lincoln and his articulating principles of equality, freedom, government of the people, by the people, for the people. Those represent philosophical ideas that have their roots in authors like philosophers like John Locke, who argued for the fundamental goodness, decency of human beings, based on the basis of which people were capable of governing themselves. They didn't need a monarch, a father figure, someone to keep them in tow. They were fundamentally good and decent. John Locke also, among others, articulated ideas of natural rights, that there were certain fundamental human rights and dignities that we owned just by virtue of our status as human beings, our elemental status, your rights to life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, principles that are enshrined in our Constitution and the fundamental doctrines of American government that have had a profound influence, on governments around the world, constitutions around the world. Philosophy was also responsible for the French Revolution. The French Revolution was more impactful in its time than the American Revolution. America was a set of colonies in the New World. France was at the center of Western culture, the center of world civilization at the time. It had a system that goes back to feudalism, a feudal sort of organization of society with different categories of people. The writings of the philosopher Jean-Jacques Rousseau was instrumental in advancing ideas of a social contract that became the basis for the French people deciding it was time to change their system of government, to change their fundamental organization of society. Enlightenment philosophers were individuals who advanced, people like Voltaire, advanced ideas of equality and liberty. As I mentioned in some of my previous talks, notions of freedom are central to philosophy, as central as anything that there is. And freedom, not just in the sense of freedom within a society, but what we might call an existential freedom. The freedom from the constraints of the past, freedom from our expectations of the future, freedom from what we observe applying to other people, in other circumstances at other times that do not necessarily apply to our particular circumstance. So philosophy has had this enormous influence upon just the organizations of society. It even was responsible for creating, inspiring communist systems of government. Karl Marx was the originator of communism as an economic system, as a political system. He was a philosopher. He was a gifted philosopher. He was one of those individuals that began writing philosophy at a young age. When he was 8, 9, 10, he was writing sophisticated, sort of philosophical, you might call it disquisitions. That's an elaborate word for little essays in philosophy. So philosophy has had a profound impact upon every contemporary form of government. Beyond that, I've mentioned philosophy created science as a methodology, but its influence didn't end with the creation of science. It's been a guiding force for science at its highest levels of achievement, even up to recent years. Even among the greatest achievements of the human mind is 20th century physics, the physics of relativity theory and quantum mechanics. Well, Einstein and Heisenberg were physicists, but their work was infused with and guided by fundamental philosophical considerations, without which their results would have been impossible. Both Einstein and Heisenberg were doing what I characterize as the physics of existentialism. The idea that we can't leave the world to view the world. In general, our common sense idea of reality is something that we see from the outside, that we understand from the outside. But we can't do that. In principle, we can't do that. That's theoretically impossible. The strongest results in the history of physics have been achieved, again, in relativity and quantum mechanics, by coming to terms with the fact that we can't view the world from the outside. We have to come to terms with it from where we stand. And that involves the embrace of the philosophical principle, again, of existentialism that is, I find, so subtle, even as it's obvious that all of the main figures in existentialism, in the history of existentialism, beginning with Kierkegaard, I find struggled to articulate the clarity of that result. We cannot leave the world to view it. So there's the degree to which philosophy has recent influence. I've used my philosophical results to develop results in molecular biology, approaches to cancer chemotherapeutics, the use of mutated or modified viruses, was something that I developed as a theoretical investigation after I wrote my first philosophical book to establish an application to something outside of philosophy using some of the rigorous principles that I was elaborating philosophically. So, philosophy has enormous power. Now, where does that power ultimately come from? It comes from the fact that philosophy is simply the limit, the exercise of rigor. The incontestable. That's all philosophy is. That's all philosophy cares about. But rigor at the highest possible level. The world today seems to embrace this concept of rigor as the highest level that we're trying to achieve in different directions and different disciplines. A scientific experiment is admirable, is worthy of incorporation into our body of understanding if it's a rigorous experiment, done rigorously, if it achieves those high standards of intellectual demand. Mathematics has results that must be rigorous. Otherwise, it's not a pure mathematical result. So rigor is one of these concepts that at this point in the history of culture, we hold in high regard. In fact, within intellectual culture, I'm not sure that there is a concept held in higher regard. Well, philosophy embraces that concept to a level that exceeds that of any other discipline. So from the philosophical standpoint, the standpoint of philosophical rigor, science is not achieving rigorous results at all. It's theoretically impossible for science to achieve a rigorous result because of fundamental features of our world, of what I call our space, the space in which we exist. Simply, the fact that the world is different in different directions means that we can't have an experimental group and a control group that eliminates all variables so that any difference between the two is due to the drug that one individual gets and that the other doesn't. It's something that I discuss a little bit in Phalaris's bowl that I will talk about shortly. Okay, I'm kind of just leading up to this because I want to develop some of the ideas that are developed to some degree in the play, but maybe not within the context that I'm providing right now. Well, and what's interesting is that not only is the fact that the world is different in different directions sufficient to make a controlled experiment theoretically impossible, it turns out even if the world was identical in different directions, it would still be theoretically impossible simply because of the notion of a different direction that we're looking in for a control versus an experimental group. So again, from the rigorous platform that philosophy embraces, and again, all philosophy is the limit of rigor. That's it. From that position, science does not achieve that highest level. In fact, if it did achieve that level, it wouldn't be able to help us in this world. It's part of the nature of a scientific result is to be useful in terms of promoting survival. And that usefulness depends upon seeing certain degrees of similarity that are not rigorous, but are approximate. So for example, we learn that a hot stove burns. And so we learn to avoid touching a hot stove. And we generalize from that to avoid touching anything that resembles a hot stove. Okay? From the standpoint of philosophical rigor, any distinction between any two objects means that whatever applies to one need not apply to the other. Now that condition of rigor is not the condition of sort of daily survival, but it is the condition of religious salvation, what the religions have sought as the ultimate solution to human experience. And again, some of these ideas are developed in the play, but I wanted to just, again, so everything that I say can be developed more. Some of the things I'm saying will not necessarily be fully understood, right? Nothing that you hear the first time, if you're hearing this the first time, is fully understandable. That's the nature of our understanding, that in general, we don't learn anything as well as we relearn. We have to encounter things from lots of different directions and in lots of different ways to really get, a deep understanding. And that's true for philosophy. It's especially true for philosophy because philosophy is making claims about everything and from every possible direction. But one of the things about rigor, just to amplify it a little bit, because I don't detail it so much in the play, since it's something that I've developed a little bit more in the last few years, since writing the play, is rigor is simply a matter of difference, of distinction. We exist in difference or distinction from everything else. It's if we were not distinct or different in some way, we would merge with whatever that object that we were identical with was. And again, from the standpoint of rigor, difference in position, difference in time, those are differences that are as significant and as decisive as any possible differences. The philosopher Wittgenstein, one of the great philosophers of philosophical history, arguably now the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and I've told this anecdote before, but I'll tell it again, because again, not everyone has heard this. Like to begin his books with introductory quotations. He didn't publish that much, actually. He published one book in his lifetime. His most famous work, The Philosophical Investigations, was published posthumously after his death. He chose a quotation to begin it from an Austrian playwright, Nestor. It is in the nature of every advance that it appears much greater than it actually is. It's a statement of humility. But Wittgenstein had considered using a quotation from Shakespeare's King Lear, where the king's counselor, Kent, says to the aged king, "I'll teach you differences." Now, that's a little bit harsh, right? Severe, but philosophy tends to be severe because the stakes are so high. The issue of decisively coming to terms with what we can rigorously know is so important in terms of our dealing with this world in all its dimensions, that philosophy is often even brutal in its formulations. And to illustrate that, a lot of the writings that I do are either introductory, to a realm of philosophical understanding. They're meant to summarize, or they're meant to introduce, or they're meant to conclude, to summarize. I write mostly in what's called aphoristic form. I write aphorisms, concentrated philosophical statements. Well, one of my books begins with a short introduction that summarizes some of this issue of philosophy's severity, the aspiration to a certain level of rigor that makes it both harsh sometimes from the outside, but also powerful enough to solve human problems in every direction. It refers to, and I'm going to recite it. It's very short, but it refers to a lecture that a professor of philosophy at Harvard, Robert Nozick, once gave on the language of philosophy, and it makes a reference to the philosopher Nietzsche, the 19th century German philosopher, and to Wittgenstein, and it goes like this. Robert Nozick once gave a lecture on the language of philosophy. Not its sometimes technical vocabulary, or worse, its scholastic excursions, but the diction of its aspirations. He spoke of its characteristically violent imagery, of the force with which it sought to drive home results. He didn't mention Nietzsche's will to philosophize with a hammer, but might have. Wittgenstein once told of tearing someone's argument to shreds. The person didn't give in. His position held too much charm. But Wittgenstein had done his job. The job of philosophy is to establish the reality, incontrovertibly, exercising the internal criterion of an incontestable rigor. Standards of rigor may lengthen, and fair contentions eventually fall. What matters is what stands. Only what stands against all possible force can answer our needs. Only the irresistible solves the world. See? So that's the mood, the spirit, the temper of philosophy, because how much matters that it attempts to address, right? An aphorism of mine that's in a similar vein that I wrote many years ago, preeminently, philosophy is a weapon. It kills on behalf of the meaning of the world. It's basically interested in removing everything that we think we know, because ultimately that's the source of human pain. That's the source of human suffering. That's the great discovery that Socrates made. That's why Steve Jobs famously remarked, "I would trade all my technology for an afternoon with Socrates." What did he hope to learn from Socrates? He hoped to learn this. Now it's my formulation of the impulse, that's operating within Socrates. We suffer, not because of what we know, and not because of what we do not know, and not because of what we cannot know, but because of what we think we know, unjustifiably. That is, as much as anything, the philosophical enterprise going back to Socrates, to eliminate false claims, unjustifiable claims, that philosophy is not about opinion or theory or faith or belief or assumption, what I call the provisional. It's about the incontrovertible. And we suffer not what we know, but what we think we know. We think we know what's ahead of us tomorrow. We think we know the significance of historical events. We think we know how a pandemic will play out. We think we know what human history will amount to. We think we know the destiny in store for us. We think we know that disease, old age, and death is what is our fate. We think we know these things. Thinking is not knowing. And philosophy demands the limit of rigor that will not entertain what we merely think is so. And that is its power. That's its ultimate power. I've given a number of examples of that, in my talks. The idea that our decision-making, and it's something that I deal with in Phalaris' book, in the play, our decision-making is fundamentally misguided in every instance, because we can't ever make a decision, see how it turns out, and compare it to an alternative. That's not the nature of existence. It doesn't allow that. We live and think as if it did. That's why we suffer. Or there are many reasons, but they're all kind of connected. I have aphorisms that express that sometimes when different individuals hear some of these, it frees them from the burden of their expectations, among other things. There's one, we suffer because we think the past is fixed and controls the future. The reality is the opposite. past is not fixed. The future decides it. And that goes back to some fundamental principles that I do mention in Phalaris's Bull as one set of responses. And there are a variety of ways of approaching these fundamental philosophical solutions. I've written about 20,000 aphorisms, and they're all approaching the same core of understanding, but from different directions. A favorite pair of aphorisms that's extremely powerful in dealing with the whole range of human concerns and sufferings. Past cannot guarantee the future. The future decides the past. Simple as that. Because the fact that something has happened before does not guarantee it has to follow the same pattern again, because of any difference that applies, pertains now compared to when that pattern, that sequence of events previously revealed itself, previously appeared. And again, from the standpoint of rigor, that's, if one believes in the concept of a God, it's reasonable to think that that God is a God of precision, a God of rigor, where rigor represents the highest level of precision in thinking. One of the comments in Phalaris's Bull is, we suffer the death of people around us, because we're convinced, or we believe they will not return. That's part of what the concept of death implies, at least in our, sort of common sense view of it. And I respond in the play, they will not return to the end of all time. And how exactly do you know that? Where does that knowledge rigorously come from? And the answer, of course, is we don't have that knowledge. But we live in terms of it. We live as if we did. And so we live a tragic sense of life. I make a fundamental distinction, and I introduce this at the very beginning of the play. If you've seen the play, I come out and I address the audience before the start of the play itself, where I talk about Phalaris's Bull. Before I explain that concept, and I'm going to deal with that in just a second. I come out and I define these two words, epistemic and heuristic. They also encapsulate the solution, the philosophical solution to the world, to be grand about it, but I'm being serious. The epistemic is another term for philosophy, for what's incontrovertible, what's known at the limit of rigor. These are all synonyms, basically. The heuristic is everything else. If something is not incontrovertible, such as the past can't guarantee the future decides the past, it's heuristic. And that includes opinion, theory, belief. It includes everything in science. It includes every sort of technological process. Okay? It includes everything other than pure philosophical rigor. Well, these are, I know, abstract concepts, and I don't want to go on too much about things that are technical in that way. It's probably easier to read about such things, than to hear about them in certain contexts. But and I like to tell people that even if you don't understand something fully, sometimes hearing it, can be helpful, and then it can put you in a position to understand it, more deeply, more fully the next time you encounter it. It can plant a seed. I mentioned previously that Picasso didn't understand mathematics much. He didn't know calculus, but he liked to look through textbooks of advanced math, because he would learn something just from seeing the form, in which it was written. It was helpful to him. He learned from that. So just to give you a sketch, when I talk about epistemic and heuristic, and I talk about it at the beginning of the play, and I talk about it at the end of the play, I'm talking about very robust concepts. I'm not talking about things that are simply a matter of definition, or are a matter of definition, but from a lot of different directions. There are a lot of different ways to define them because they don't hinge upon a simple, definition of a term. Well, the epistemic is, sometimes I define it a little bit mathematically. Imagine 2 points. How they differ is the epistemic. The condition, the mathematical condition of the epistemic, an epistemic space, which is kind of a mathematical idea, is that A is not equal to A. It's a non-identity space. It's a space in which no 2 points are the same. It's a space in which nothing can be described, only named. It's a space in which ultimately there are no concepts within the space. We can talk a little bit about it from the outside, but not from within. It's actually the landscape of Eden that I'm describing by this space. It's the world that you would see in front of your eyes if you could remove from that perception the sense of the past, knowledge of what you're seeing, and the sense of future expectation for how those objects are likely to advance in time. It's the world that you would see with first sight. It's another philosopher at Harvard, Stanley Cavell, a prominent philosopher also when I was there, talked about a sense of earliness, what you would see when you first encountered the world. The preconceptual world, that is the epistemic. It's also an existential space. We exist in difference from everything else, so we exist in distinction from everything else. It's also the space in which, again, what applies to me need not apply to you or anyone else. So it's the space in which we are freed of whatever concepts are imagined to apply, including concepts of mortality, disease, old age, and death. It's a space that achieves what Buddhism strove for. And I talk about that in the play too, like the logic of Buddhism, which is a fairly powerful response to the human condition and uses a logic based on the analysis of change and persistence, but it has some arbitrary assumptions. Philosophy is able to achieve that ultimate Buddhist sort of response, but rigorously. And that's what the epistemic is describing. Everything else is the heuristic, it's the opposite. It's a conceptual space. It's a space in which things can be described. It's the space of technology. It's the space of language, where things are clustered together based on similarities. It's a convergent space. And it's the space in which we create. When we create new objects, new technologies, we're bringing things together. That process of bringing things together is generally described as a convergent process. Any type of intellectual discovery, any type of process that we're trying to develop represents a convergence. And the first application I did of it was the development of the theoretical underpinning of the use of modified viruses as chemotherapeutic agents. The reasoning that went into that was an illustration of convergent reasoning within heuristic space. Now again, I know that's a little bit technical, but just so you've heard it, because you probably, if you saw the play, you've heard some reference to those concepts. I just wanted to give you a little bit more, just to hear, to feel, for how robust those concepts are. Okay, now, a little bit less technical. I tell people when it comes to the title, and the title sort of is comprehensive in a way. I mean, again, I'm writing things in philosophy that are very concentrated, and I like even, again, 5-7 words to summarize, a great deal of thought and analysis. Like the incontrovertible solves the world. Existence resolves to salvation. God is a skeptic, generating time. Those types of aphoristic formulations. Well, the title, Phalaris's Bull, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World, has 2 parts. Phalaris's Bull, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World. When I first wrote the play, the second part was the title. That was the working title, Solving the Riddle of the Great Big World. It's not metaphor. It describes what philosophy and my philosophical work is striving for. It's what every philosopher has, any significance historically, has striven for. Wittgenstein wanted to solve all philosophical problems. When he wrote his first book early in his career, he left philosophy because he thought he had solved all philosophical problems. At some point, he realized maybe not, and so he returned to the writing of philosophy. But the goal is to achieve that limiting solution, okay? Well, so solving the riddle of the great big world is what philosophy aspires to. It is actually a phrase that came from Einstein. When Einstein was 11, he wrote in a notebook that that's what he wanted to do, to solve the riddle of the great big world. So I read that somewhere and I thought, this is a perfect sort of title for what I'm aspiring to do philosophically. Well, when I began the play, I had no background in acting. I had been on a stage, if you want to call it a stage, once previously, and that was when I was 10, and that was in the 5th grade in a classroom, in a school auditorium, actually. We were doing some scenes from history, and they were not acted scenes, they were tableaux, where you would pose, okay, like in a painting. And I was in a scene illustrating something about Sir Francis Drake, the English explorer. I was Sir Francis Drake, and I stood there with a sword. That had been my previous acting experience until Phalaris's Bull. So, because I had no experience whatsoever, it was arranged that the director, David Schweizer, who was in New York, would come out to Los Angeles and work with me for a couple of weeks, just to sort of introduce me, to what would be involved in acting a one-man show, a one-person show. Well, since I was uncomfortable acting, but relatively comfortable talking, like about philosophical issues and other issues, every day we begin our session that would go on for a number of hours, but to ease into the session, I would talk about something random that happened to be on my mind. And one day, I don't remember exactly where it came from, but I happened to mention Kierkegaard's story of Phalaris's Bull. Phalaris was a 5th century BC Sicilian ruler who, again, this is like, long ago, and the historical records are not, abundant, but supposedly his wife, or one story is that his wife had a relationship with another man. And Phalaris, the ruler, who was known for his cruelty, apparently, took exception to this. And he commissioned a sculptor to create a torture device, Phalaris's Bull, which was a hollow metal shell formed in the shape of a bull that a victim would be placed inside of, and a fire would be kindled underneath, so that the person inside was burned alive. Right? It was horrific, a horrific torture. But what made it especially diabolical, according to legend, is that it was so engineered that the sound of the victim's screams would be transmuted into the sound of a mooing cow. You know, like it would be sonorous, it would be music coming out. Well, for Kierkegaard, who was an early 19th century philosopher, Christian philosopher, but also a romantic writer in the sense of like European romanticism, had this romantic view, it's called, of creation, where one suffered to create, right? There was a cost to creating works of great beauty. And so when Kierkegaard read about Phalaris and his bull, he thought that was a perfect metaphor for the creative process of the transformation of personal pain or anguish into some beautiful product, a poem, a song, something. Now, just to finish the actual historical legend, either the torture device was never used. In some accounts, Phalaris thought it was just too horrific ever to be put to use. Or the other account is that he was so horrified by the conception and the design that he put the sculptor in it, and that became its only victim ever. We don't really know the actual reality, but the point is, it's a metaphor. So I told one day the director that story, and it immediately captivated him. And he said, that should go at the beginning of the play. And I found it, compelling simply because philosophy, is attempting to transform, as every religious tradition attempts to transform, as psychiatry attempts to transform human suffering into something other than pain, right? To free us, to transform. Salvation is a process of transforming from something fundamentally flawed, fundamentally awry, to something blissful. And philosophy, if it's operating at, again, the limit of its capabilities, is doing just that. Certainly within my work, that's the aspiration. One of the things, by the way, that you see in the play is I refer to moments where my philosophical results are tested, right? Where I've mentioned previously how certain aphorisms like selflessness, how one acts not out of need, seem to, for me, undercut phobias. Well, it was important, and I dealt with a number of these episodes in the play. It was important that the philosophy, my philosophical results, have the power to deal, for example, with the moment of death. Well, the earthquake experience I had in 1994 provided just that opportunity to test the philosophy, and it worked. It allayed my anxiety, my fear at that moment when the world was literally collapsing around me. And the structure I was in came within half an inch of losing a support column that would have resulted in its utter collapse. Okay? And I didn't know it was a half an inch away. I thought it was about to happen. So I experienced that potential moment of death. Every extreme circumstance, extreme physical pain, the loss of my father, who was my last family member. I'm an only child. My father was an only child. My mother came from a large family, but she was English, and her family was in England. So I never spent that much time around them. And at some point, it was just cousins, and cousins tend to separate over time. So when my father died, that was the last person close to me. And having been an only child, the presence of my parents was everything. The philosophy worked at that point. It allayed the terror, the anguish, the pain of it, like a switch, has that power. I had episodes experiencing physical pain where, again, like a switch. So that's in the play. Some of those instances are in the play. If the philosophy did not satisfy those tests, if it didn't immediately have the power to overrule whatever harsh emotion, if it didn't put me in the position of being able to control my anguish and pain voluntarily, I would have thrown it out. And I wouldn't be here, and I wouldn't be talking about it, and I wouldn't have done the play. Okay? So that's an important theme, of Phalaris's bowl. Another important theme is the applications that philosophy has. And I've already kind of alluded to those. The fact that it needs to be able, or it should be able to, if it's operating again at the limit of its rigor, to direct technological results, technological solutions, not because of what pure philosophy is or is doing, but because once you distill from everything else the rigor of it, what you're left with is the heuristic, and the heuristic is governed by convergence. And achieving any given result is simply a matter of achieving enough orders of convergence, putting enough things together, enough elements together. And I've sort of illustrated that a number of times, not in the play, but in discussing elections, that's how we decide who wins an election, by the greater number of votes. The greater number of votes really represents a greater order of convergence. Objects are convergent elements. If you want to achieve any given goal, just bring more elements together. Additional elements can be additional repetitions. You want to become a bodybuilder. You need more repetitions, you add more weights, you control for diet, you add enough protein, you add enough elements to achieve any given result. That's how everything other than the philosophic operates. So that also is illustrated in the play. One of the main themes is philosophy, and I emphasize that philosophy is about rigor. And when I was originally writing philosophy, all I was concerned about was writing a set of propositions or achieving a set of results that were indisputable, couldn't be contested. Again, like past can't guarantee future, future decides past, or 2 is not equal to 1, or propositions of that nature. It wasn't clear that they had any relationship to deeper problems of human suffering. But at the same time, I was motivated, as you see in the play, by a general sense of the unsatisfactoriness of human experience. And that's the type of response to the world that, again, has motivated the religions, motivates a lot of what we do, motivates artists. I mean, it's often said that an artist is creating his or her art because he's not or she's not satisfied with the reality as it presents itself, and is trying to engineer an alternative that is more satisfactory to live within. I mean, maybe the most famous example, or one of the most famous examples, is the 20th century architect Mies van der Rohe, who looked around and saw ugliness everywhere. He hated everything he saw. It's like seeing the fall, right? In the Judeo-Christian Islamic tradition, we begin in the Garden of Eden, right? And then an act of disobedience, ejects humanity from the garden and brings about, all the ills, all the suffering of the human experience, the ugliness of life. Well, Mies van der Rohe looked around and everywhere saw ugliness. And he wanted to create a response, an oasis, a perfection within that ugliness that was an answer to it. And his buildings, like the Seagram building in New York, one of his famous skyscrapers, he's responsible as much as anybody for what's called the international style, the look of like the 20th century skyscraper, the later half of the 20th century. Well, that was meant to be a perfection and a precision that was an answer to the unsatisfactoriness of what he saw around him. In the play, I talk about my earliest memories being nightmares. I talk about how, I was never fully comfortable in the world. That I was an only child, so I wasn't comfortable fundamentally, with other people aside from my parents, but I'm apparently was adopted, right? So I wasn't intimately comfortable with my parents either, maybe. So it's a sense of unsatisfactoriness is what tends to drive a lot of fundamental results in philosophy, in art, and certainly in religion. It's an instance is Martin Luther, the founder, effectively, of Protestant Christianity, and the concept of salvation by faith alone, faith in Jesus Christ, just faith that Jesus Christ came to earth, God in human form, and believing in him, believing in that mission of his is enough no matter what you do. So the Catholic tradition, prior to Martin Luther, had emphasized actions, sacraments, that if you had like an evil thought, if you thought of doing harm to somebody, let's say, you had to go to a confessional and confess your sin. If you died before confessing your sin, you could go to hell, or you would go to hell. So Martin Luther took that seriously. That's one of the things also about these traditions. The people that are developing them take things seriously in a way that sometimes when we look back on the traditions, we don't quite. Buddhism is an example of that. But Martin Luther would go to confessional. He would confess his sins, his sinful thoughts, okay, the thoughts that were he to die would land him in hell and damnation, which he was earnestly trying to avoid. So he would confess his thoughts in the confessional, leave the confessional, have new sinful thoughts, have to turn around and go back to the confession. This happened over and over again. He could never get himself away from the confessional. He had to create Protestant Christianity to free himself from this constraint by that tradition. So there's an issue, a problem that my philosophical work in significant measure responds to. And again, one of the famous examples is Buddhism. That when you read the historical accounts of Siddhartha Gautama, the historical Buddha who lived about 550 BC, you hear of his having been brought up, and again, it's a story that I tell in the play, having been brought up in a palace, the son of a chieftain, who, when Siddhartha was born, was told or intuited that his son would either grow up to be a great warrior, great spiritual great military conqueror, or a great spiritual conqueror, leader. Well, the father, being a warrior himself, a military leader, wanted his son to follow in his footsteps. But he could sense that Siddhartha, his son, had a sort of sensitive disposition. So he tried to wall him off, shield him from all the evils, of the world. So supposedly for the first 29 years of his life, Siddhartha lived within the palace walls and never experienced, the ugly realities of life. Well, at some point, Siddhartha gets kind of restless, wants to experience the outside world. His father arranges for him to leave the palace walls, but prepares the path so that beggars and diseased individuals and corpses are removed, right? So there's no evidence of mortality. Well, the gods, according to the legend, are watching this. They want Siddhartha to become a spiritual leader. So they create visions of an old man, a diseased man, a corpse, disease, old age, death. And that's at the age of 29, the first encounter that Siddhartha has with this brute reality of life. And once he sees that this is the fate that awaits humanity, well, he can't just sit behind palace walls anymore. He needs to find an answer. But what's interesting is, and it's central to my philosophical development, and it's in the play, is when you read his words, he doesn't say, I want to find a way to cope. What he says, I think I can remember it, tell the people of, he tells his charioteer as he's leaving behind the palace life to attempt to pursue what became Buddhism. He tells his charioteer, as he says farewell to him and farewell to his life, his comfortable life. Tell the people of Kapilavastu, that was the village he lived in, this my unshakable resolve. Either I will end disease, old age, and death, and you will quickly see me again. Or I will go to perdition, because my powers failed me, and I could not achieve my purpose. Well, we look at that and we have a tendency to dismiss it as like, that's got to be metaphor, that's got to be poetry. But no, I took it seriously. One needs to take that seriously. He was interested in putting an end to disease, old age, and death then and there. And so the philosophical question becomes, what did he have in mind? What did he think he was doing? And part of what led to my philosophical results was figuring out exactly what he did think he was doing. He thought he was interested in not going into a laboratory and finding cures for disease, old age, and death. That wasn't available to him. He was convinced that he had achieved that result by putting an end to the concepts of disease, old age, and death. Now, the way he did that is elaborated a little bit in the play, and it's something that I've talked about in previous talks, but that becomes the basis for how we can respond in general to broad human concerns. And that's what the epistemic space achieves, and that's what the rigor of philosophy achieves, putting an end to the concepts, but putting an end to the concepts rigorously in a way that Buddhism didn't quite. And that becomes a template for how we can solve the problems of our world. Okay, so that's a little, yes. So we have questions.
As usual, it's such a pity that we have limited amount of time, but we have questions and we want them to be answered. But I would like to ask you, Mr. Stephen, or Mr. Friedman, if we can answer the question from the previous session.
Oh, yeah. Good idea. Yes, I forgot. Okay, so last week I was talking about education, and I have a question on what do I think is the central, the main principle of effective learning that I would highlight. Okay. Actually, I referred to it in this talk just because I knew I was going to be answering this question. The single most important principle of learning is relearning. In other words, the first time you encounter something, you're never going to fully understand it. You're never going to master it. You want to expose yourself to it and expose yourself by degrees. Like an example to give is, let's say you want to break down a door, break down a wall, and let's say you're going to do it with a battering ram. I like to use the example of a battering ram. Well, if you go to that wall and try to break through that wall or that door with a single blow, you're likely to break your arms. You don't want to do that. And you don't want to kind of encounter anything you're trying to learn, anything you're trying to come in contact with like the full force of your effort. You're not going to achieve understanding that way. What you need to do is, with the battering ram, you do it gently and then harder and harder and harder. That is how I approach learning. You know, it doesn't matter what it is. If I have to read something and come to terms with it, understand it, master it, I'm going to first read it through. I'm going to first glance over it, just to acquaint my mind, just to introduce my mind to it. I might just look at the words on the page without even fully reading them, just seeing them. That's an introduction. Okay, then I'll go back. What I might do is, I might kind of skim through it. I might sort of look for highlighted words, or if it's a textbook, a textbook is written like an outline. It has divisions and subdivisions, and it has things in bold. I'll look through it, and I'll just kind of acquaint myself with the divisions of the topic, with what's highlighted. I'm beginning to form in my mind a kind of a structure, an outline, because I want the material in my mind. I don't want it on the page. I tend not to write things down. I tend to use the written page, the written work, the image on the screen as my reference. And I want to transfer that into my mind. But I will do it by a series of encounters. Okay? After I've sort of skimmed through it, I might read the opening paragraph and the closing paragraph. Those are the most important ways to introduce and to summarize. They provide an excellent orientation, to the fundamental content, because I want to have, as much as anything, a sense of the overall structure, the overall impulse behind the writing, what it's trying to achieve. Then I'll go through and I'll read it patiently. But when I read it patiently, I've emphasized this before too, I'm reading it as if I really care about it. I'm reading it as if this might be a field that I'm going to devote my life to. Even if I've encountered it for the first time, maybe it will be the field that I devote my life to. I read an article today about a woman surfer, and a professional surfer in India. It turns out that up until about 10, 15 years ago, there were very few professional surfers in India. She apparently, 20 years ago, there were 15 in the whole country, that India did not embrace the waters around the continent. They saw it more as a burden and a threat than as a source of fun or enjoyment. A lot of, apparently, members of Indian society didn't know how to swim. Well, this woman said that the very first time she went on a surfboard, she fell in love with surfing. The very first time. And that became her career. And she then became the main person building surfing as a professional sport in India, from her first encounter with a surfboard. Okay, so your first encounter with a subject could be the encounter that changes your life. But the point is, you want to take it seriously in that way. Okay, that you're not doing it because it's a burden. You're not doing it because you have to do it. You're doing it because it may be an opportunity to change your world. Okay, so you have to be open to it. You don't want to fight the experience, but then repeated encounters. Again, like the battering ram, you don't get through the wall the first blow. You go back and back and back. If you read something and it's hard, you reach a point where it's hard, don't spend the next 2 days or 2 weeks trying to understand it. Read right through it. Go to just continue past it. The next time you go back, maybe you'll understand it a little better. Don't try to make it hard for yourself. Try to make it easy for yourself. And the way you make it easy is to have repeated encounters with whatever it is. Again, learning is never as effective as relearning. That is my fundamental principle of achieving mastery, of achieving understanding. The first time you encounter anything, you're not really encountering it well. And then I also emphasize too that, and these days with the internet, we can go to different websites. We can go to Wikipedia, or you can, whatever it is you might be reading about, you could search and read a few different perspectives on it. And you don't have to read thousands of words on it. You could read a sentence or two about something from a different perspective, a different author. Those are the kinds of convergences. I'm talking about, what am I talking about here? I'm talking about using convergence to achieve a result. I'm talking about repeated encounters. I'm talking about encounters from different directions. And I'm talking about not placing the burden on the first time you meet something. Okay? And I'm also talking about having the right mental attitude. This might be the subject that wins you over. This might be what you learn from this encounter, might be what you can use in some other area of your life that changes it, that makes possible results that no one's had before. It was Einstein's ability to add a little bit of philosophical perspective to his physics that made him Einstein. So, that's usually how we achieve results, by adding things from different directions, by encountering from different perspectives. So don't demand too much of yourself on any given encounter. Just be prepared to go back and go back and go back, just like a battering ram again. Okay?
Yes.
So not learning, but relearning is the key.
Yes, I would say that this is what happens with our regular talks, because from the beginning it's quite unclear, and then it becomes more understandable in the process.
Yeah. It's exactly the same thing, right? And even if you were to watch one of these talks, like let's say you watch this live, you will not understand it as well as the second time you see it through, or a third time. I mean, there are I teach people, I tutor, right? Usually one-on-one. There are subjects that I've taught 100 times. Every time I do it, I learn a little more. I see something that I never saw before. I'm better, at it, and my understanding is clearer. There's no end to that process.
Yes, and let's get back to our today's questions from our viewers, and the first is from Ansar. Mr. Friedman, why philosophy isn't capable of responding to the question, what is the sense of our life? Why we came here? What are our aims and purposes? Does word philosophy have a summarized answer?
Okay. No. Philosophy deals with your circumstance as it presents itself, right here, right now. So when you think to yourself, where did I come from? You're asking for a perspective on your life from outside the world, before your life. That's the fundamental illusion that philosophy identifies as the source of our pain. That's when I talk about the power of relativity and quantum mechanics, I'm talking about the power of experiencing the world from inside the world, from where you are. That's why it's a matter of, like, the Delphic Oracle in Greece talks about what, knowing thyself. It's like what you need to come to terms with fundamentally is where you stand. But, and here's, I know this is going to sound a little bit tricky, but when you think about solutions in, like, the different religions, which are trying to achieve ultimate solutions to the world, something like mystical union with God in the Christian tradition, or enlightenment in Buddhism, or Satori in Zen Buddhism, or salvation generally. What's characteristic of all of those final solutions is all the concepts disappear. So when you're formulating those questions, you're formulating them within a structure of language. And that language, that linguistic structure that you're formulating those questions within, exists for one purpose only. That language is existing to coordinate your actions with those of other people for the benefit of survival within a society. As a group effort, language exists to coordinate our behavior with others. So, but the solution to the world philosophically is not based upon your relationship with others. It's based upon the nature of your situation independently of language. And so those questions are basically questions that are formulated from outside yourself. And anything formulated outside yourself is not ultimately the solution. It's the solution, or it might point, it's what we would call a heuristic solution. It would have some value in terms of achieving some kind of end for society, but it doesn't resolve the problem of the individual. What that fundamental philosophical solution and religious solution is achieved when those concepts disappear. And achieving a means of ending those concepts is the most difficult of all intellectual undertakings. In other words, the fundamental task is to move beyond the concepts. And that's what philosophy does through its exercise of rigor. That's what Buddhism does through its analysis of change. That's what concepts of God do when they imagine all things becoming one thing. Because when all things become one thing, all distinctions disappear and all concepts cease. So again, it's something that can only be achieved. The solutions that we're pointing to, the solutions that philosophy and the religions are aiming at, are solutions that involve the ending of the language, the ending of the concept. So you get expressions in Buddhism. The attempt to say these things in Buddhism will take the form of, it is not the case that we are born. It is not the case that we are not born. It is not the case this. It is not the case not this. In other words, the concepts are not achieving the solution that we're aiming for. We have to move beyond them. And all of these major traditions is finding some way of doing that. And the two main ways of doing that are the limit of divergence and the limit of convergence. Philosophy does it through the limit of divergence, where everything is seen as radically different from anything else, and so no concept can bring any two things together. The religions like the theisms, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, in their mystical form, are doing it through the limit of convergence, where all things come together in God. When all things become one thing, all the concepts vanish. Now, the using the rigor of distinction, though, is a rigorous process. Imagining things coming together is not. That's something that we have to kind of imagine happening, as if we were imagining all the objects in the room becoming exactly the same color, for example, and the same tone, so that we no longer saw the different objects. They all just kind of vanished before our eyes because we couldn't distinguish one from the other. That's how the concept of universal convergence works. That's how the concept of God works. The concept of philosophy works by recognizing the radical distinction between every two things, so that what applies to one need not apply to the other. And when that is embodied, when you're seeing things in that way actively, then the concepts go away. And so then the questions can no longer be asked. The questions are, well, a technical way of saying it is an artifact of the language. They're not fundamental to our circumstance, even though they seem to be. I know it's a difficult issue.
It is.
It's the most difficult issue, because we're talking about, like, what does the world look like, in mystical union with God? What does the world look like if we have experienced what Siddhartha Gautama experienced at the moment of Buddhist enlightenment? What does the world look like when you are seeing it when you're seeing a purely rigorous space? Like I say in the play, the landscape of philosophical rigor is the landscape of Eden. So what is it like to actually, remember I distinguish the world into two basic categories, the epistemic and the heuristic. The objects we see around us, most of our social life, our embrace of language is a heuristic space. Only pure philosophy, the limit of rigor, is an epistemic. What is it like when we leave the heuristic behind and just step in to the epistemic? That's equivalent to stepping into that Buddhist nirvana, that Buddhist enlightenment, or that mystical union with God. It's the world right before in front of our eyes, but it's the world stripped of concepts. And it's stripped of concepts because it's ultimately stripped of our sense of what came before that we cannot know rigorously, and what comes after that we cannot know rigorously. So another way to answer that question is that those questions are asking for what is not rigorous. And philosophy only embraces what's rigorous, but it turns out that that embrace is in fact the solution that we seek. Whatever is not rigorous ultimately is the wrong direction, the opposite direction. We think it's the direction that we want to go with. It's the opposite. It reminds me of something that the medieval philosopher Maimonides once said. It was the best thing he ever said, and that is, reverse everything you believe. You'll be closer to the truth than you stand right now. So it's like we think those questions are the pressing questions that are pointing us in the direction we need to go, but they're actually based upon some misunderstandings of our circumstance, some misunderstandings of the nature of language, how it is functioning. But again, I know that's a little bit hard.
All right. There is also a question about what Roman Empire philosophers are you interested in, or what do you like? But let's move to the further question. And to that question, you will answer like via email. And next time the poster will appear, it will be listed.
Okay. Oh, let me just, okay. Yeah. Okay. So the other questions will go. I'll answer at the beginning of next time, right?
Or this way, okay. Another question is from Ansar. People live extremely short life, don't we? But why do we spend our life and time uselessly? Some people consider their lives as a sort of validity. Why is idea of improving ourselves beneath our radar?
Well, again, not clear that we live short lives, right? It's like what don't we know? We don't know what's coming next. And like we think, for example, that the sun will rise tomorrow and the sun will set tomorrow night, because why exactly? I mean, because it's happened in the past. So again, philosophically, we're not going to embrace anything less than what's rigorous. And that means we can't make claims about the moment to come. But there's a lot of times when we think of what we should be doing with our lives, we're thinking in terms of what people outside of ourselves, what people on social media think we should be doing with our lives. We're making comparisons that we don't need to be making. That when you read certain philosophers like Thoreau, the solution is right here, right now. We need to understand the uniqueness of our circumstance, the dignity of our circumstance, and it's not necessarily a matter of going from where we are to some other place, achieving some goal. That's a heuristic concept. That's the kind of thing that helps society. It's the kind of thing that, again, imagine how you achieve a goal. You achieve a goal by working towards that goal. Working towards that goal is putting elements together, achieving a convergence to gain that goal. That's not the epistemic. That's not the pure philosophical solution. The pure philosophical solution is understanding the fundamental nature of your circumstance in its certainty right here, right now. And its certainty is independent of any projection as to what might happen or what you think you should, the direction you think you should be going in. Remember, I've given that example of the boy who's given a horse, and everybody thinks it's wonderful, and the Zen master says, "We'll see," and he goes through a series of different events, and every time the people around him have a judgment, it's good, it's bad, it's good, it's bad. The Zen master's response is always, "We'll see." Because so to think that we have to achieve a certain goal, and I know this is a little, that is sort of a social type of imperative. The philosophical, but let me say this. Philosophy's position on the achieving of goals is first understand the nature of the philosophic reality. First understand the rigor of your of your circumstance, then do whatever you will. But I can't tell you what to do because, again, your circumstance is different from mine. And any difference between your circumstance and mine means that I'm not in a position to judge, and I'm not in a position to guide. The fundamental nature of the dignity of existence demands that only you can be responsible for your choices. But from a philosophical standpoint, first understand the rigor of your circumstance, that you don't know what's going to come next. You don't know what's in your best interest. Once you kind of come to terms with the reality of the philosophical rigor of your situation, then the Buddhist admonition applies. Die while alive, die to concepts, and do whatever you will. All is good. So there's that. But in order for that to be embraced, you have to embrace the philosophic truth of your circumstance, the rigor of your circumstance, which is understanding what you do not know, but only think you do, in terms even of where value lies.
Great. We still have questions, and let's go through them very quickly. So, yeah, we have Philosophy Day, and let's devote more time to philosophy today. There is a question from Amir who asks, I don't know if it is a relevant question, but what do you think about?
Yes, that is a relevant question. I will not. There's actually. It's in my, I refer to it in my play, actually. And I'll answer that question by making reference to the answer I give in the play. And that is, there was a professor I had at Harvard. His name was Rogers Albritton. He was, again, and every professor in the philosophy department at Harvard when I was there was an eminent professor. You know, Harvard at that point had arguably the best philosophy department in the world. And so Rogers Albritton was especially noted as a Wittgenstein scholar, it turns out. So I happened to have a lot of contact with him because we shared that interest. Well, at one point, Rogers Albritton said that he didn't think anyone under the age of 40 should get a PhD in philosophy. Okay, that was Albritton's, sort of decided opinion. Now, in the play, I make note of the fact, and this is also something that is well known. I didn't know Wittgenstein. He died in 1951. But Wittgenstein's belief was that no one should get a PhD in philosophy. He thought that philosophy was an activity, not an act, that the academic philosophy that was done, was practiced, was a death sentence. He was interested in leaving the university. He spent relatively little time at the university. When he was young, like 18, 19, 20, he was at Cambridge. He was there until World War I broke out. Then he went off to the war. He was Austrian, so he served in the Austrian army. He was writing this book, the only book that was published in his lifetime. It was 80 pages. It's called it has a Latin title, Tractatus Logico-Philosophicus, a Latin title. He didn't, another philosopher gave him that title. But it was a very thin book that was published. After he published that book, he thought he had solved all philosophical problems, and he left philosophy for 20 years. And he went and became a school teacher in Austria. He worked as a gardener. He lived in a hut that he built on the coast of Norway. And then he was visited by someone who he had studied philosophy with, an Italian, they were discussing something about the logical form of a proposition. This Italian made a gesture, like, what's the logical form of that? And when Wittgenstein saw that gesture, he realized that there were limitations to what he had done philosophically, that he hadn't solved every philosophical problem. And so at that point, he decided he needed to go back and do more philosophy. So he went back to Cambridge. Now, he had left without a degree. In fact, he didn't have any degree, but he, they respected him. That book that was published had become famous. So they gave him effectively a PhD, and he stayed at the university until, while he was there doing the philosophy that would become the basis of the book that was published after his death, he was always complaining about it. He never liked the life of a professional philosopher, and he was always discouraging his students from pursuing that kind of life. In fact, even when he was at Cambridge, teaching philosophy, but not really teaching it, his classes were not classes where he would teach philosophy. They were classes where he would think out loud and do original philosophy in front of the class. And the class was in his rooms, at the university. But he was always encouraging his students to do something practical, and at one point he wanted to leave philosophy and become a doctor, so he went to the university's medical school, and he asked them, and they looked at him like he was crazy. They said, look, you're one of the world's greatest philosophers and you want to be a doctor? What are you thinking? Well, he didn't end up doing it, but he had that kind of relationship with the subject. He did not embrace the academic world. He did not embrace academic philosophy any more than I do. And a lot of famous philosophers, Kierkegaard and Schopenhauer, there's a long list that really, there's a tendency in academic philosophy for the subject to feed upon itself, not to be fructified or nourished from enough outside experience, enough divergent experience. So the term is scholasticism. If you look at medieval philosophy or modern philosophy, there's a lot of writing not about the world or not trying to solve fundamental issues, but a lot of writing about other philosophy. I've helped people sort of write papers, and they'll end up writing a paper on a sentence in Aristotle. So there's a narrowness that not everyone is. So at a certain level, degrees in philosophy are not often embraced by a lot of these celebrated historical philosophers.
But let's help our viewers to obtain this degree and answer this question. Mr. Friedman, what are the most valuable and important aspects in our life? Is it time? Maybe it's happiness, or even it's unknown? Thank you.
Well, okay. I think it's coming to terms with the dignity of our circumstance. The fact that what you are experiencing in its detail has never been experienced by anyone before and never will be experienced by anyone again. That basically you are a world. And so far as you know, there's no existence outside yourself. How could you possibly know that there was unless you could leave your world and view it from the outside? And so it's a matter really of coming to terms with the wonder of our circumstance. And that wonder is muted because our concepts lead us to seeing, again, not what's in front of our eyes, not what we're genuinely experiencing, but our concept or our idea of what we're experiencing. And that's how we fall into patterns of repetition. And that's the kind of thing that dulls our perception of experience and diminishes our sense of the reality that we really want to be experiencing. So the most important thing about our circumstance is that we exist in distinction from everything else, that no one can share our circumstance, no one will ever share this circumstance, and that at its core is, when it's understood, is the experience of what one might say an ineffable wonder.
Thank you so much for answering all these questions, and thanks to our viewers for asking them. And we have a very nice comment from Ansar, who is congratulating you with the Philosophy Day. And Ansar wanted me to read it. I'm so grateful for all you've done for us people who gather here every Friday to listen to you. I can't recite how many information I've got.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that. You know, I know that a lot of the things that, you know, philosophy deals with are difficult or can be difficult, you know, but I hope that repeated exposure, you know, like I've been emphasizing, makes things clearer and clearer, and ultimately there's a simplicity at the core of what I'm saying and what I'm trying to say. And I hope that that simplicity and that dignity and that freedom, you know, of circumstance, what I'm interested in doing is helping people free themselves from the oppressions of the circumstances they imagine that they're in. That's really an illusion. So I'm trying to help, and I'm gratified that, you know, that people are, you know, are getting some perspective, you know, some understanding. And I think, again, repeated exposure is the best way to deepen, you know, one's response and one's understanding. And the most important thing of all is that these encounters lead people to have thoughts of their own, and that they come to terms with their own circumstances, because again, I will never be in your circumstance, anyone else's circumstance. And so I can't judge, I can't evaluate, I can just offer the perspective of my circumstance. And I hope that provides some inspiration and maybe even some guidance to others.
It surely does. Very, very much appreciate all your time and all your wonderful thoughts and the thoughts that you are sharing with us. So happy Philosophy Day to all of you, and thanks for joining. We will hope to see you next time, the next session, next Friday, November 27th. At the same time, please prepare your questions and ask them even in advance. You can mail to American Space email, almaty@amcorners.kz. So we'll be looking forward to hearing from you soon, and have a wonderful weekend. Goodbye.
Thank you so much, everyone. See you next week.